Hi, welcome to all of you. I'm so pleased to see you at the Marconi Society's Decade of Digital Inclusion event series. Today, we're kicking off our very first virtual track, the 6G Summit on Connecting the Unconnected. For those of you who are meeting us for the first time, the Marconi Society is a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that the opportunities of the network are available to everyone on the planet. I'm the Marconi Society's Executive Director, Samantha Schartman, and our chair, who you will have the privilege of hearing from today, is Vint Cerf, one of the creators of the internet and leading visionaries of our time. The event series that you're joining today is bringing together leaders in technology, policy, and digital inclusion. Our goal is to create conversations and collaborations that will help us bring the and underconnected online in a way that is accessible, affordable, safe, and engaging. Next slide, please. We are proud and honored to have some incredible sponsors for this event, who we are dedicated as we are, who are as dedicated as we are to ensuring digital inclusion. I'd particularly like to acknowledge our top sponsors, Cisco, Crown Castle, and Sigrid and Vint Cerf. So thank you to those three. Next slide. But they're not the only sponsors today. These organizations that you see here and people have supported our event series in so many ways. The breadth of our sponsors is one of the best testaments to the interdisciplinary nature of this event and the opportunity we're going to address. Next slide. So because of the generosity of our sponsors, this allows us to offer tickets for the entire 6-week event series. It is going to feature 75 experts. There are 17 total sessions, including this one, and it's only $49 for the general public and $25 for students. So if you haven't registered yet, please, I hope you will do so today. You can head over to marconisociety.org/decade to do so, and you can find a way to register for all of our future events. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Mohamed-Slim Alouini of KAUST, who will kick off our session. Thank you so much, Slim.
Thanks a lot, Samantha, for this nice introduction. Let me start by welcoming all our delegates who are attending online the 6G Summit. I would like also to acknowledge our local sponsors, KAUST, of course, the Marconi Society, CITC, WWRF, and Frontiers. The way this summit is going to go, we'll have 3 days, each of roughly an hour and a half. Today it will be a little bit longer because we have some opening remarks, and at the same, it will start at the same time, and we'll hear from really some of the main voices, some of the main brains working in this area of digital divide and connectivity divide. For today, we'll start with an opening session with some opening remarks by myself, Dr. Vint Cerf, Dr. Tawfik, Jelassi. Then we'll hear from 4 speakers, and we'll conclude our session with a panel on basically some of the possibilities that are out there to connect the unconnected. So let me start by sharing my screen and giving some, okay, I hope you all see my screen. Okay, so what I would like to highlight in my opening remarks that connecting the remaining 4 billion should be viewed not only as a research for us, researcher in the field of wireless communication, but of course also an opportunity for the future communities and societies. So as we know, as we are deploying 5G worldwide, we, as again a community of research and wireless communication, have started already brainstorming about the next generation of wireless communication system. And here we are talking about beyond 5G and 6G, which are expected to be deployed by the early 2030s. So of course, many of us are always very motivated by pushing the envelope type of research, which means we're going for higher speed, lower latency, more massive connectivity, connectivity anywhere, anytime. But and this is, of course, a topic that has been, I would say, researched by, there have been many perspective papers on this topic over the last couple of years. However, what we would like to focus on in this 6G summit is what is motivated, but what we're seeing here in the map in front of you. So obviously, it goes without saying that we do suffer from serious gaps in global internet connectivity, and we tend indeed to forget that we still have about half of the world population, this number of about 4 billion people, that are still lacking internet connectivity. And it's expected that 5G, or at least in its current initial deployment, is going to further accentuate this digital divide. This is the well-known Matthew effect, where basically the rich get richer and unfortunately the poor get poorer. And the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that obviously connectivity divide is becoming, in a way, the modern face of inequality. And the reasons are many. So there are, of course, some social reasons like lack of computer literacy, some lack of knowledge of the language being used on the internet, of more generally lack of, let's say, relevant local content that make people not really motivated to connect to the internet. But there are also some technical and economical reasons. So let me highlight two of them. The first one is obviously the mobile network operator work on a return on investment type of model. And while they invest quite a bit of money to acquire spectrum, to buy some capital equipment, eventually it doesn't make much business sense for them to lay hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers of fiber optics to reach some low, sparsely populated, let's say, rural areas. So that's one reason for behind this digital divide. But also there is, of course, this important aspect, which is this correlation between the lack of connectivity and the lack of a power grid. We have, of course, to remember that to have a reliable telecom network, we need to rely on a reliable power grid. And many of the developing countries, unfortunately, either they don't have a power grid in some areas, or if that power grid is there, it's basically not reliable. And by the way, this connectivity divide is not touching only rural areas in developing countries, or sometimes even in developed countries. It can reach, or it can touch, let's say, the heart of the mega cities. Here we're talking about slums or favelas, where basically affordability can become the main issue. Basically, if we are dealing with a situation where we have a low expected revenue, calculated as an average revenue per user, this well-known ARPU, if we have a low ARPU, this reduces the appetite of companies and their willingness to invest in these areas. So obviously, the objective of this summit is to kind of talk about ways to bridge the digital divide. So if we are able to provide high quality global connectivity, we can essentially, or say hopefully, break this vicious digital divide and enable richer and denser communities to share their knowledge, and as such strengthen the economies of less fortunate and more sparsely populated communities. In other words, we'll offer the often economically and socially isolated 4 billion who are currently either unconnected or underconnected, the experience that comes with, or the benefits that come with connectivity, from access to better healthcare, from access to better education remotely, to smart farming, to new jobs, as well, of course, to real-time banking and a variety of financial services. So in my view, to achieve digital inclusiveness, we develop what we can call thrifty wireless network solution based on low-cost backhaul, and we'll hear tomorrow about some aerial and space solution in tomorrow panel. We would like also to see low-cost access solution. Thursday, we'll be hearing about some low-cost access solutions that are being deployed. And then, of course, we would like to rely on low-cost or standard smartphone, tablet, or phablet to reap the benefit of the economy of scale. So let me now in the remaining, let's say, few minutes, highlight some research that we have done here at KAUST over the last year, since the last or the first 6G Summit on Connected and Connected. One thing we have done is to try to come up with, let's say, a metric to quantify at a high resolution this connectivity divide. So as you know, there are some, let's say, ways to quantify the telecommunication service imbalance at the country level. I'm talking here, for example, about the GCMA Mobile Connectivity Index or the Inclusive Internet Index, but these, again, they are provided at the country-wise level. What we were after is a high resolution, let's say 20 kilometer by 20 kilometer type of hexagon database to be able to basically get an idea about this imbalance at this level of resolution. And the key here, without getting into technical details, is to access to two open access databases. The first one is the OpenCell ID database, which gives how base stations are distributed worldwide, as well as the high resolution Facebook Connectivity Lab density population. And with that, to make a long story short, we were able to develop this index that quantifies the level of imbalance. So here, just taking as an example, the country of Uganda, where clearly around big cities like the capital, Kampala, the situation is relatively good. But then as soon as you get into deep rural area within Uganda, obviously you suffer from deep digital divide, as illustrated by the red and orange type of hexagons. Now, we did the same thing for a country like the US. Obviously, the situation is much, much better. However, we still see in a country like the US still some pocket of digital divide in some area in the Midwest, where you see quite a bit of red and orange. So if you want more information about this project, I invite you to visit this website and to read more in this technical paper that has been published recently in IEEE, and you can interactively check for your country of your choice about the level of digital connectivity. So that's kind of direction number one, which was about characterizing digital divide. Let me now give you an overview of some of the ideas that we are proposing to, let's say, help bridge the digital divide. One idea is to use aerial solution, in particular UAV. So this paper with my PhD students, Mohamed Matrashia, and my postdoc in my group, Dr. Mustafa Kishk, we developed this framework based on stochastic geometry, where we shown that if you use UAVs to basically help or assist rural communities, we are able to improve coverage area quite a bit. So the model is very simple. We assume that within a city, we have a high number of base stations, and as such, coverage is secured. But as you move away from downtown, basically this decrease, and we assume an exponential decrease in the density of base station, and as such, you will suffer from certain digital divide. But to compensate for that, we are adding some drones to help basically connect the unconnected in these rural areas. To make a long story short, these are the kind of results that we're able to obtain. So as a benchmark, you can see this blue curve that's acting as lower bound, that is basically illustrating the coverage probability as functional distance from the town center or downtown, let's say, without any drone assistance. And then you see, obviously, as you move away from downtown, basically your coverage probability decrease quite fast. Now, as soon as you start injecting some drones into your network, obviously you start recovering in terms of coverage, and the more drones you put, the better is your coverage. The second and last topic I would like to highlight is that basically, if we use, remember one of the issues I was highlighting is this issue of lack of power in some of the rural areas. And the idea that Murillo proposed in this paper is basically to attach base station to wind turbine. So the wind turbine will not be only a source of, let's say, power in rural area, but also will be source of providing telecom services. And of course, where should we place these turbine and base station? It will be in areas where we have favorable wind statistics. We did some studies in Western France, Southern Argentina, and even Ethiopia. So let me here highlight what we have seen in Argentina, where obviously the turbine were not placed from a coverage perspective. It was like a wind turbine farm. So we had to propose some extra location for wind turbine, to which we attached some base station. And what we showed is that obviously doing that, we can improve considerably the data rates. So solving the fact that you can get access to rural areas and providing connectivity at the same time. So these are some of the highlights of some of the work being done at KAUST in this area. And I'm sure over the coming 3 days, we'll hear about a lot of research being done in some research groups in industry and academia about bridging the digital divide. So with that, I conclude my opening remarks, and we are all here hopefully to, let's say, fulfill this interesting and prophetic, let's say, a statement made by Nikola Tesla more than 100 years ago. I would like now to give the floor to our second speaker in this opening session, Dr. Vint Cerf. So let me introduce Dr. Vint Cerf. Obviously, Vint needs no introduction. As Samantha mentioned, he's the chairman of the Marconi Society and the vice president and chief internet evangelist of Google, USA. He is widely known as the father of the internet. He, as you know, he's the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocol and the architecture of the internet. So this is just a very brief introduction for Vint, who doesn't need an introduction. So Vint, the floor is yours. You are muted, Vint.
That's probably the most common expression in the last 18 months is you're muted.
That's right.
Thank you for reminding me. And thank you for the introduction. By the way, I'm not the only father of the internet. There are a lot of them. I'm just happy to have been one of them. It takes a lot of people to make anything of this scale actually happen. So the first thing is you've already brought up some very important points. If you're going to try to improve internet infrastructure and connectivity, you have to know where it isn't. And you also have to know where is it not functioning adequately. So those high resolution measurements are very important. What's interesting about those measurements, however, is that unless you do it right, you may actually get results that are confusing because, for example, in a residential setting where people are using Wi-Fi, it could be that the Wi-Fi arrangement is poorly matched to the connectivity of that residence or office building to the internet service provider. And so distinguishing between poor performance that is a result of inadequate Wi-Fi configuration and inadequate access to the internet turns out to be very important because you could reach incorrect conclusions without doing that properly. At Google, about 10 years ago, we started a project we called Measurement Lab, or MLab. It's now housed in the Code for Science and Society, but Google continues to be an active participant in collecting data from speed tests that individual users can run. When they run those tests, we ask them to confirm that we can take that data and accumulate it in a publicly available database for others to analyze. The measurement, the Marconi Society is participating with this program, developing new tools for the evaluation and analysis of the collected data. We have many terabytes of information accumulated over the past decade or so. You also implicitly mentioned electrical power, and I guess it's very important for everybody to keep in mind that if you don't have any electricity, it's really hard to run anything associated with the internet. The equipment tends not to work. So, of course, there are places that don't have reliable electrical power, and for that we rely on batteries that can be charged in one place and then used elsewhere. And we do see that happening in various parts of the world where electricity is not reliably available. But in the long run, we need electrification as well as connectivity to the internet. What we have been seeing, of course, is that the internet isn't useful unless it runs well. And so in the course of doing all these various measurements, we discovered, for example, Wi-Fi configuration as a challenge. There's also a phenomenon called buffer bloat, which has to do with the way in which the buffers of the routers that interconnect the users to the public internet, those buffers can potentially be misconfigured in a way that creates a very slow and sluggish behavior of the system. And that's a matter of configuration. And in the end, though, in addition to doing good engineering, we also have to see how powerful wireless has become as an access method to the internet. We could see the telephone system going, as you implied, from 3G to 4G and now 5G and someday 6G. We're still debating some of the details. Wi-Fi came sort of in the middle of all that as an extension of local area networking and Ethernet techniques on coaxial cables. And now more recently, we're seeing a substantial initiative to put low Earth orbiting satellites up in place. Again, another wireless access method, which if it goes as the promoters of low Earth orbit satellite communication are saying, will make it impossible to avoid access to the internet, because these tens of thousands of satellites will be literally able to reach every square inch of the Earth, not only the land mass, but also the oceans as well. So that's the connectivity that we anticipate is significant. The problem, of course, that you alluded to is that it may not be affordable, either because of the equipment costs or the actual business model of the provider of access to internet. And so we need to find ways of driving cost out. We may need to turn to government regulation in order to provide subsidies for people who otherwise couldn't afford access. And there's a good reason for doing that. It's because the value of the internet comes partly as a result of the number of people who are able to get access to it. And my honest belief is that until the internet is available to everyone, we will not have extracted the value that it's capable of supplying. So I look forward to the day when we can say that 100% of the world's population has access to the internet if it wants it. Just two other things to mention. When the typical providers of high-speed internet service offer either fiber to the home or coaxial cable or hybrid fiber coax, at some point they often find that it's no longer economically feasible to use those technologies to connect people. And so we see a lot of opportunity for wireless ISPs to form. Sometimes they're cooperative, sometimes they're just small businesses. But the idea there is that they can extend access to the internet further and locally. You mentioned drones, and of course there are some issues associated with drones, not the least of which is the longevity of a drone. How long can it stay up? How much weight can it carry? It needs batteries not only for to be held in the air, but it needs battery power in order to deliver internet service. Google or Alphabet, the holding company, did try to do that with balloons, untethered balloons. The company was called Loon, and we almost got there. Technologically, it worked, but I think the economic engine that was needed in order to make it sustainable didn't quite make it, and we ended that effort. But it's very clear that there are many different alternative ways of getting there, wireless being a pretty diverse alternative. And so naturally, the Marconi Society is interested in that, since Mr. Marconi was responsible for bringing the radio world into commercial operation. So I'll stop there and turn this back over to Slim, and look forward very much to the conversation that we will have as a panel. Slim, you're muted.
Sorry, again. Okay, of course, we tend always to forget that, right? So thank you, Vint, for the very interesting opening remarks. Let us now give the floor to the third speaker in this opening session, Dr. Tawfik Jelassi, who is now the Assistant Director General for the Communication and Information Sector at UNESCO in Paris. Dr. Jelassi has extensive experience in higher education, scientific research, and information and communication technologies. He was Program Director and Professor of Strategy and Technology Management at IMD Business School in Lausanne from 2015 to June 2021, and he joined in July 2021 UNESCO as the Assistant Director. And prior to that, he served in many positions, including as the Minister of Higher Education, Scientific Research, and Information Communication Technologies in Tunisia. So let us give the floor to Dr. Tawfik Jelassi.
First of all, I would like to thank the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology and Dr. Mohamed-Slim Alouini for the kind invitation. I appreciate this opportunity to reflect on some of the broader considerations and principles to help guide future 6G development, speaking both in a personal capacity and on behalf of UNESCO. The momentum to shape 6G standards is a global one. It spans institutions both in the global north and the global south, including research collaborations such as the ones undertaken by your university and other similar high-level research institutions all over the world. This global knowledge exchange and multi-stakeholder consultation based on open science principles is the key driver of transformative digital innovation to support sustainable development. It is clear that 6G, while not clearly defined yet, will be able to dramatically enhance and empower other digital architectures and technologies. These include machine learning, autonomous networks, robotics, and the Internet of Things, as well as 6G for cloud computing and edge computing, decentralized blockchain applications, and quantum computations. We'll even see 6G being associated with augmented human intelligence as researchers seek to integrate the human mind with real-time computational power through wearable and implanted micro devices. We all agree about the transformative impact of these technologies on a 6G backbone. However, we must assert the need for a human right-based and ethical navigation and reflection within our technical communities. The realization of 6G requires key institutions and actors to advocate a multi-stakeholder approach for digital development that can drive innovation, being open, more inclusive, universally accessible, and respectful of human rights. You may be aware that UNESCO has a history of promoting a human rights-based approach to science and technology while fostering international dialogue and ethical reflection on these issues. This coming November, the 193 member states of UNESCO will discuss and hopefully approve two international normative instruments, one on the ethics of AI and the other on open science. The rights-based governance of technology also brings us back to foundational and internationally agreed upon human rights values, including those developed through the United Nations. Being the UNESCO Assistant Director General for Communication and Information, my remit includes the promotion of freedom of expression and universal access to information, both online and offline. Since 2015, our work on internet development has been guided by the Internet Universality Principles, which were endorsed by the 193 member states of UNESCO. These principles are called the Rome Guiding Principles. You have this on the slide. R standing for rights-based, O for open, A for accessible, and M for multi-stakeholder, while also considering X, meaning cross-cutting issues such as gender equality that should also be taken into account. These Rome principles guide our approach to internet governance, but also the development of technologies surrounding internet networks, notably artificial intelligence. Internet universality calls for a networked connectivity model that is accessible and inclusive to all stakeholders, while also including considerations of rights-based and ethical dimensions of AI. Rome is a practical compass which includes key considerations for the future of 6G, which should apply a human rights-based approach, openness, ensure accessibility, and the multi-stakeholder with gender-sensitive approach, which I mentioned earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate this opportunity to share with you some thoughts and information on the principles and practical tools that may guide technological advances into the future. In particular, I hope that the ethical and human rights-based dimensions of science and technology, as well as the internationally agreed upon normative foundations and practical toolkits that UNESCO developed, I hope that these will be of interest to you in your future work. In this spirit, I look forward to continuing such dialogue with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jelassi, for these interesting remarks. So now we move to the panel, and we'll start the panel with basically 4 speakers who will give their point of view or their vision on this topic. And then we'll move to the Q&A, or let's say, or the discussion part of the panel. So in this panel, we have 4 distinguished speakers. Milo Medin, who is the Vice President of Wireless Service at Alphabet, Paul Garnett, who's the CEO of Vernonburg Group in USA, Elizabeth Belding, who's professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Jallow, who is a Senior Liaison Officer of ITU to the United Nations in New York City in USA too. So let's start with our first speaker, Milo Medin, and I'll give a very brief kind of bio. Milo, as I mentioned, is the Vice President of Wireless Services at Alphabet. He has been part of the Internet development community for more than 25 years. He's currently the Vice President of Wireless Services at Alphabet, where he oversees the company's gigabit fiber to the home project and other efforts to improve access to the Internet. Milo, the floor is yours. You can basically unmute yourself.
All right, thank you. Let me start by saying something that may be obvious to many of you, but an important part of the conversation about what 6G and 5G, for that matter, really means. That is that the speed of wireless data flows depends on a large part on how wide the channel or spectrum being used is. The wider the channel, the higher speed a user can enjoy, and the higher capacity that sector can deliver overall. Going to multiple base station sites can increase total system capacity through increased frequency reuse, but peak speeds that a user can get are still driven by how wide the channel is. One of the big changes from LTE to release 15 5G was increasing the total spectrum a single user can use from 100 megahertz to 500 megahertz. And 6G will increase that even more. Of course, that only helps if you can bring additional spectrum to bear in actual deployments. Without that, 5G and 6G will only bring a modicum of performance improvements. Large amounts of new spectrum are not available at lower frequencies, but only higher ones. Reallocating mid-band spectrum, or spectrum above 2 gigahertz and below 6 gigahertz, can yield a few hundred megahertz of spectrum. A lot more spectrum is available in the millimeter wave bands. But these higher frequencies do not propagate as well as lower ones and generally cannot penetrate indoors at all. So using these bands, even at higher power levels, requires many more base stations to be deployed than traditional macro cell networks. I was the co-author of a Pentagon report on 5G that was released in 2019. The unclassified version can be downloaded easily. Just search for Defense Innovation Board 5G report, and Google should find it for you. In that study, we used a set of tools inside Google that leverages our enormous geospatial data and cloud compute resources to model how many base stations would be needed to deliver 100 megabits to a single user at the edge of the sector to about 70% of the US population. In contrast, while microcell networks operating in the US can cover like more than 90% of US population with just about 50,000 base stations at UHF frequencies, 3 gigahertz spectrum would need over 1 million base stations to cover more than 70% of POPs, and more than 13 million base stations at millimeter wave spectrum because of these differences in propagation. This is not just about space on poles or on rooftops and power. It's really about fiber deployment, which is needed to backhaul that data to the rest of the internet. There's really only one network, the wired one, with a little bit of wireless at the edge. You can't be a leader in 5G or 6G without being a leader in fiber deployment. A good measure of this in a country is about how many fiber to the home service customers a country has. Because if the fiber goes that deep for residential access, it can also serve to trunk smaller and smaller cell radiuses that higher frequency spectrum requires. By the way, China is the clear leader here. Last data I saw was that in the first quarter of 2021, China had more than 477 million fiber to the home customers, and the entire rest of the world was about 120 million. So in the end, 5G, and especially 6G, depends not just on spectrum available, but on the fiber optic infrastructure to backhaul that traffic to CDNs and cloud providers that are providing that data that wireless networks will consume. You can't be a leader in 6G or 5G without being a leader in fiber as well. Thank you. Back to you, Slim.
Thanks a lot, Milo. Excellent remarks. Let us move now to the second speaker in our panel. And here I would like to invite Paul Garnett, who's, as I mentioned earlier, the CEO of Vernonburg Group in the USA. Let me give a kind of a brief, let's say, bio of Paul. So prior to founding the Vernonburg Group, Paul was the Senior Director of Microsoft Airband Initiative. The Airband Initiative's portfolio encompassed over 100 projects in 20 countries across 5 continents, where Paul and his team work with internet service providers, energy access providers, and other partners to deploy new last-mile access technologies, cloud-based services, and business models that extend broadband internet access for tens of millions of people. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Alouini, for that introduction. And hopefully, what I'm about to say it helps, nice compliments what we've heard earlier from you and Milo and Vint already. So I'm going to cover 2 quick topics in my opening remarks. First of all, I'm going to have a little bit of an overview of the broadband connectivity landscape. And the digital divide and the issue of digital inclusion. And then I'm going to talk specifically about an idea in relation to something called environmental, social, and governance investing and the role that can play in helping to close the global broadband divide. So just to start, we know that half the world's population is not currently online. And specifically, what generates that statistic that's probably most often quoted is a questionnaire that basically asks whether or not an individual consumer has access to the internet in the last 90 days. So not every day, just once in the last 90 days. So even among the let's say half the world's population that's now online, there's some huge differences within that data set in terms of quality of connectivity and the experience that consumers are actually getting online. But when one looks at all of the literature that's out there in relation to digital inclusion and digital inequality, what we see is that it disproportionately impacts people who are low income. They're located in rural areas, in small island developing nations, and in landlocked developing countries. They're often people who are lacking literacy and are lacking in digital skills. And they are from traditionally disenfranchised groups, such as women and girls, persons with disabilities, and ethnic minorities. Another thing to remember is that digital inequality persists around the world, regardless of what market you're in. So, to use the example of New York City, pretty much everyone in New York City has access to the internet and access to broadband. But when it comes to fixed connectivity, 1.5 million New Yorkers do not have a fixed broadband connection at home, which is kind of amazing. Out of a population of 8.5 million people in what one would think would be one of the most advanced cities on the planet. The other thing that's interesting, what we've seen really over the last 30 years is those that are at the bottom are catching up in terms of the basics of internet access. So people are getting 3G mobile internet connections. They're starting to use those. They're getting access to public Wi-Fi hotspots. But where the divergence appears and is actually getting worse, as Slim, you mentioned earlier, is with regard to enhanced capabilities. So things like unlimited data consumption on a high-speed mobile connection or having a fixed connection at home. We're seeing a wider and wider gap. Think of the difference between 2G and 6G. That when 6G gets introduced, there are still going to be people in the world who are on 2G or 3G connections. And the other thing you mentioned earlier, Slim, which is true, which is the COVID-19 pandemic has really sharpened our focus on this set of issues. And I think sometimes you don't want to let a good crisis go to waste in some respects. And this is an example where COVID-19 has really shown in stark terms how bad these gaps can be. And the example that we often hear about is in education, where 1.6 billion school children were sent home from school around the world who do not have connectivity at home. And think about what that means for their educational opportunities. They're expected to learn and online, and yet they don't even have an internet connection in their homes. So if you look at the efficacy of efforts to date with regard to digital inclusion, of course there is a lot of progress that's been made, and a lot of goals have been set. So I don't want to downplay any of that. Oftentimes what we see are the goals that are adopted, especially at the international level, do tend to be pretty much the least common denominator kind of goals. So things like, everyone needs to have a 256 kilobit per second fixed connection isn't going to do you much good when the rest of the world has 100 megabit per second connection, or goals around mobile connectivity. But even at current projections and even using those kind of goals, it's likely we're going to fall short of hitting targets, right? So if you look at the Broadband Commission's goals for the next 5 years, it's likely that those targets are not going to be met at current projections. So we've got to do something to change that trajectory. So we need to increase the goals. We need to do more, and if we do that, we can achieve a lot. And I think that we talked about some of these already, but the hurdles are pretty well understood. So you look at what the challenges that we all face, and I think we all understand what a lot of those are. So we talked earlier about data, and you really can't solve a problem you don't really understand. So the more data that we have at the higher resolution, the better we can address the challenges that we face. Things like regulatory uncertainty and fragmentation, if we can reduce that uncertainty, if we can reduce that fragmentation, do things at the regional or even global level, that can make a huge difference in terms of bringing technology to market. Access to financing is a huge issue, especially for companies that are just getting going in emerging markets. So what can we do to help to enable companies who have great ideas and have great business models that can help to close the digital divide, get access to the financing they need to grow? Just the lack of available infrastructure, deepening fiber into networks, as Milo said, making services and technologies more affordable and more consumable, increasing digital skilling and increasing literacy for that matter. And also just making sure the content that is available is increasingly relevant to users. And added to that, I think we also need to take a much broader view of available technologies and business and regulatory models. Vint talked about some of those interesting new fixed wireless technologies that are in the market today and could be used to help address some of these challenges. And oftentimes we think too narrowly about what's available to address these issues. And then I think just as a segue into the ESG or environmental social and governance topic, we really need to elevate digital inclusion to the top of the global policy agenda. And of course, among ourselves, we all think it's really important. But if you get into a higher level discussion with world leaders or policymakers and looking across all the policies that they're trying to address, I think oftentimes our issues don't end up making it to the top of the list. And I think part of the issue that really has gotten in the way of that is there really is a lack of a groundswell of support in private sector to tackle this challenge. And I'm not just talking about network operators here. I think they do an awful lot. I'm talking about the broader private sector across all sectors, not taking this as seriously as I think they should. So that brings me to this idea around ESG investing, or environmental, social, and governance investing. So I think a lot of you have probably heard about this recently. If you read any business section of any newspaper in the world, there are increasingly stories about ESG investing, and it's often, more often than not, in the context of climate change and directing investments and holding companies accountable for helping to address climate change. But ESG investing has been around for 50 or 60 years, starting in the 60s, and initially was focused on things like, divesting investments in companies that do business with the South African apartheid regime, and things like tobacco and other socially important issues. But if you look in the last, let's say, 5 years, and certainly in the last 2 years, interest in ESG investing has really taken off, and in particular in the context of addressing climate change. According to the Financial Times, ESG investments are currently thought to total about $32 trillion. And according to MSCI, which is an ESG index provider, they project that over the next 2 or 3 decades, the millennial generation, which I'm not a member of, but I'm always proud of what the kind of things they do, alone could put between 15 and $20 trillion into U.S. domiciled ESG investments, which would roughly double the size of the U.S. equity market. So while efforts to address climate change definitely get the most attention in ESG ratings, ESG ratings do look at a wide range of socially important issues. Another thing to remember about ESG investing is it's both carrot and stick. So it's meant to put some pressure on companies to do things differently, but it also is meant to give companies credit for the things they are doing already to help address major social and economic issues. And as you probably have seen, major financial institutions have pledged to make ESG investing a central part of their investment activity. So that brings me back to the issue of digital inequality and digital inclusion. And I would argue that, and I think we probably everyone on this panel would agree, that digital inequality is growing and risks becoming one of the most important factors contributing to global economic inequality over the next 25 years. And just as they are doing for other social and economic causes, such as climate change, Wall Street can play a powerful role in helping close the global broadband gap. And there's no question that universal affordable broadband access can fit into the ESG framework under the S in ESG, certainly social. And there are some ESG ratings agencies, such as MSCI that I mentioned before, that do include access to communications in their current ESG rating system. And MSCI definitely is much more transparent than some of the other ESG raters that are out there. But even what MSCI is doing, and presumably others, these efforts today are really uneven and anemic at best. Even when accounted for, access to communications is weighted as the least important issue for communications, wireless, and telecommunications providers, less than any of the issues that they're held accountable or credited for. And many of the world's largest connectivity providers are not held accountable at all for or rewarded for their efforts to increase access to communications. In addition, major tech companies like Microsoft, that I used to work for, which now controls some of the largest telecommunications networks in the world, are neither rewarded or held accountable for their efforts to close the global broadband gap. And that doesn't even account for all the other industries that increasingly rely on connectivity for their success. I mean, think about it. I mean, I would be hard pressed to name any industry that's not reliant on connectivity for its future success. So why wouldn't this be part of ESG ratings? So in closing, given the importance of unlocking opportunities and to social and economic development, ESG-related investment should reward meaningful and measurable efforts to close the global broadband gap. That's just one idea. I'm sure we're going to talk about a bunch of other things, and thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thanks a lot, Paul, for letting us know about how ESG investing can be used to help close the global broadband gap. Let us now move to the third panelist, Dr. Elizabeth Belding, who is professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and who will talk about expanding the focus of digital innovation. Let me give a brief bio of Professor Belding. Professor Belding research focus on mobile and wireless networking, including network performance analysis and information and communication technologies for development, ICTD. Her ICTD projects have included work in Zambia, South Africa, Mongolia, and refugee camps. Most recently, she has been working with Native American communities around the US. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Slim. Appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. So as Slim said, I'd like to talk about how we can expand the focus of digital innovation. And I'd like to start with just a little bit of statistics. So we've already heard this morning that in the 52 years since the internet has been created, we now have access for about half of the world's population, which is, fantastic on one hand. And I think a lot of this panel is focused on the other half of the 50% or the other 50%. So how do we get access to the remaining 50% of users or people who want to be able to use the internet? But I'd like to instead pick up on something that Paul was talking about at the beginning, which is trying to understand more deeply what a graph like this actually represents for the 50% of the population that does have internet access. And in particular, a graph like this, which is from the ITU, is really just an indication of whether or not they have access. And Paul indicated that, this data might represent whether or not someone has been able to access the internet in the last 90 days. And clearly, if you're accessing the internet every 90 days, that's very different than having the internet at home or in your pocket, as I like to call it, pocket access with your mobile phone. So I think it's really important to dive deeper into a graph like this and not just take it at surface value and say, okay, so we know 50% of the population doesn't have access and we need to address that. But what about the 50% that does have access? And should we just assume that everything is just fine there? And so, there's lots of ways that we can try to quantify what an internet user is. We've already heard that we can talk about it in terms of frequency of access. And, obviously, if you're accessing the internet only once every 90 days, your model of how you use the internet is going to be very different than if you have that home or access in your pocket. So this is more data from the ITU that looks at where people access the internet, and in particular, if they have internet availability at home. And so what we see is that the vast majority of people in the developed world are able to access the internet at home, whereas in the developing and least developed countries, they don't have that home internet access. So if they're lucky, they might have access at school or at work, but much more likely is that they're accessing the internet at an internet cafe where they might be paying per byte or per minute. They might be accessing it at a library. And, we saw in the COVID pandemic, something that had been happening for years, even here in the US, which is that people without home internet access were showing up in McDonald's parking lots and hotels in order to access free Wi-Fi so that they could do their schoolwork and work and stay connected. And so, this really very obviously changes the model of usage, where when you have that home access or that pocket access, you have a very casual relationship with the internet where you might access it tens or even hundreds of times per day to look something up very quickly or check your email. Whereas if you're having to travel for internet access, you're probably pre-planning what you're going to do. You're time limited. There might be someone over your shoulder waiting for their access to your terminal. You might be, again, paying per minute or per byte. Some people have been known to pre-type emails in order to save on the cost of internet access. And yet, in the graph that we first saw, these individuals would still be considered internet users. So obviously there's a huge discrepancy there. We can also look at internet access by the speed of access. And another great data point Paul mentioned was that some people are going to be on 6G while others are still on 2G. And that's very true. We see huge discrepancies in access, both at the country level as well as within countries. People have very different levels of data speeds available. And, this is really important because we're all accessing the same internet, right? We're all trying to access the same web pages. And it's not just a matter of slowing things down if you have a slower connection, but some of that content is even going to become inaccessible, because what we've seen over the last, well, basically since the internet has been born, is that web page size and complexity has continued to grow year over year. And so this is just looking at the change in size over the last decade and the types of content that appear in a web page. And basically what it shows is that web pages, as we know, are getting much, much bigger. They have embedded images, embedded videos, embedded fonts. And so if you're using an internet access technology from a decade or two ago, but you're trying to access today's internet content, you have a really big problem where it's going to take an inordinate amount of time just to get a single page. And so these two graphs dive a little bit deeper into the prior graph. The graph on the top left is an indication of the growth of web page size over full 10 years. And so it shows that the average web page size is about 2 megabytes now. And in the bottom right, we can see the growth of images. And of course, there's videos and other things. And so if you're paying for the time you're using the internet or the byte count, this really diminishes the usability of the internet. And so even again, in that initial graph, even though you're being counted as an internet user, much of the internet might be pretty inaccessible to you if you're behind one of those really slow connections, and if you don't have that home access. Lastly, I just want to show a graph of where the data lives. So this is a graph of data centers around the world and the rough numbers of data centers. And so again, unsurprisingly, it shows that the data centers are located in the places where access tends to be much better and internet connectivity is better. And so, it's a double or triple impediment to people where now, if you're in the middle of Africa or in the Far East, not only do you have a slower connection and it's harder to get the internet access in the first place, but your data probably has to physically travel a much greater distance, which of course increases propagation delay. And so it takes longer to get that web page. Web pages are also, because they have so many embedded objects these days, they can be hosted on many, many different servers around the world. And so all of that adds to the complexity of trying to get that data to the individual. So again, it creates this very difficult experience, even though they might be counted in that 50% of the population that does have internet access. So at this point, I'd like to turn to a concept called the diffusion of innovation. This was developed by Everett Rogers some decades ago, and it applies really well to technology, where you have time on the x-axis, and as a new technology is developed, we see it taken up gradually at first, and then the majority comes in and adopts it, and at the end are the laggards. And so the yellowish line shows that if you wait long enough, then everybody should have access to the technology. And when I talk about internet inequality and digital inequality, people often will ask me, well, why don't we just wait? Why don't we wait 5 years or so, and then everything will be fine? And the answer is that, well, I've been working in this space a lot longer than 5 years, and the problem's gotten worse, not better. But really what's happening is that we have development for the developed world down here, and then the developing world is up at the top. And while we can wait for technology to trickle down, the target is moving, right? Because the vast majority of computer scientists and others who develop technology are developing that technology for those who already have good access and have, high internet speeds. And so it's a moving target. And so you end up with people in the developing world, again, accessing today's internet with technologies from a decade or more ago. And so it simply doesn't work. And so this is never going to fix itself unless we also turn our attention to developing technologies for those who don't already have them or who have substandard technologies. And this is going to require new innovations because the constraints of these areas and these populations are very different than what we see in the developed world. So the population densities might be different if it's a rural area. The economic incentives are going to be different because of poverty. The needs are different. The geographies, the terrains might be very different. And so what we see time and time again is that the technology that's created for those in the developed world that have a certain set of circumstances is not necessarily appropriate for the developing world. And so we simply can't just wait for it to trickle down. And so I argue that, if we can have these dual foci where we're also trying to invest in new technologies that are appropriate for the developing world, then we can really shrink this adoption curve and get people caught up and on a level playing field. So I just want to end with one slide on the types of work we're doing in my research group at UC Santa Barbara. Our focus is on challenge contexts, which includes those in developing regions. It also includes marginalized communities or otherwise disadvantaged communities in the US. And it also includes communities that might have infrastructure that becomes unavailable, for instance, due to a natural disaster when a hurricane or earthquake wipes out what is there. So we have a focus on alternative internet access technologies, all of which are wireless. We've done work in TV white space, looking at that as a technology for bringing more communities online. We have a project starting on CBRS. We've looked at how LoRa, which is a low bit rate, but very long distance communication mechanism, can be used to partially bridge the gap to communities. And we've also looked at the use of drones for post-disaster scenarios that could then be flown in to bridge the connectivity gap that's created when infrastructure is wiped out. And all of this work is motivated and informed by the second focus of our work, which is network measurement and analysis. So trying to understand where internet access exists and what the quality of that internet access is. So, like the theme of the talk, not just saying yes or no, is there connectivity, but is it actually really usable by the people who are there that need to use it? Can they do online learning, telemedicine, and so forth? We look at how distinct communities use the internet. Sometimes there's interesting usage patterns in communities that can motivate new architectures or new technological designs that are more appropriate for the types of scenarios in which they want to use the internet. We look at how well their internet access links do meet their needs. And again, we use all of this to drive our innovations around novel network architectures and technologies. So if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing, this is my webpage. My research group is the Mobility Management and Networking Lab at UCSB. And then Pueblo Connect is our most recent project, NSF funded, on getting technologies for some of the Native American pueblos and reservations to get them online. So thank you for the time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. Very interesting remarks. I like in particular this connection between connecting the unconnected and also establishing connectivity in the case of a post-disaster situation, because indeed there are some interesting kind of parallel that can be made between these two scenarios. So before moving to the Q&A part and the debate part of our panel, let me give the floor to our fourth speaker, Jallow, who is the Senior Liaison Officer of the ITU to the United Nations. She's based in New York City in the USA. She'll be talking about an overview of connectivity in the least developing countries and small island developing states. Let me give a brief bio of Aida. Aida is a lawyer by profession with a master's degree with merit in law from the University of London. She started her career as a regulator in the Gambia, her native country, for 4 years. And then she had many positions. And more recently, as I mentioned, she's now the ITU Senior Liaison Officer to United Nations in charge of the least developing countries and small island countries. Aida, the floor is yours. Aida, I think you are muted.
Sorry about that.
Yes, now we hear you.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad that my presentation will be following closely that of Elizabeth, because she did talk about some of the challenges, as did Paul, on connecting the unconnected. But I think sometimes these discussions are a bit far removed when we don't actually talk about the communities and the countries that are actually facing some of the challenges of not being connected to the internet. As we know, the COVID pandemic has impacted all the countries, but you can imagine that the impact would be greater felt in countries that have weaker economies, underdeveloped infrastructures, dependencies on developed economies, and ICT, as we have seen, have proved to be both resilient to the impact of COVID-19 and an important tool that we are all using to stay connected and for digital transformation. I'm trying to change my slide slim and it's not working.
Aida?
Yes, I'm trying to change my slides. It's not moving.
Yeah, I think yes. I'm not sure what's the issue for. I mean,
it's Vint. One possibility is you need to be in the window that has the slides being presented. I don't know what you're using.
Yes, I'm there.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, but you're still at the first slide here. Can you move to the next slide?
Yes.
Let's see, we're still seeing the first slide.
Okay. So when we talk about the development needs, what is the status quo? If we zoom into small island developing states, we see that 30 to 70% of workers are in very vulnerable employment. We see 14% that have absolutely no access to electricity, and we see 60% that do not use the internet. And there's a 14% from GDP lost on every natural disaster. So where and what are the LDCs? The least developed countries, they're predominantly countries that are in Africa and some small island states. And the characteristics they have in common are that they have low saving rates, they have poor and vulnerable institutions and infrastructures, they're highly dependent on international aid and trade. So you can imagine in a period of COVID, when every country is trying to deal with its own internal problems, there won't be much of that going around. They also have low literacy rates, and they have inadequate technology and capital. So 49 of these least developed countries, 33 of them are in Africa, 10 are in Asia, you have 1 in the Caribbean, and 5 in the Pacific. Some of the small island states, Now, what constitutes connectivity in the LDCs? Of course, we have the international backbones, the international connectivity. We have a backbone made from microwave and fiber backbones. Then we have the last mile connectivity. And I think I'll talk about that a little further. So when we come to international connectivity, especially for sub-Saharan Africa, what we find, which is very interesting, is that among the countries, most of the countries that have the greatest impact in terms of not being connected to the internet are also landlocked. They're not just least developed countries, but they are also LLDCs, which is landlocked least developed countries. Looking at the terrestrial connectivity using the fiber backbone, the main form of broadband access in Africa is still wireless. So still our mobile phones are very important to us. And it's interesting that in this discussion, we're talking about 6G, uses of 6G. And I like what some of the speakers previous to me said about the disparity, because you find that in a lot of these countries, people are still using 2G. Sorry. Now, this is just the top 25 countries in Africa by internet users. And you see that the first country on that list is Nigeria, mainly also because Nigeria is the most populous country on the continent with the biggest population. And then it goes down to Egypt, Kenya, with Burkina Faso being right down there. When we talk about international bandwidth usage, looking at the bandwidth usage in the rest of the world, and looking at what LDCs are using, I think it gives a very clear picture of the challenges that we have in connectivity. We are so far behind what the global usage rates are. The mobile network coverage in Africa also has a big divide between urban and rural. The divide is highest with 4G infrastructure. And incidentally, we're now talking about 6G, but now we're seeing where even in 4G, you see a digital divide, where 75% of the 4G coverage is in urban areas with only 22% in the rural areas. 23% of the population have absolutely no access to broadband. Mobile subscriptions, we've also noticed a decline of mobile subscriptions in the LDCs and developing countries, but we feel that further research is needed to establish whether this is due to the economic effects of COVID-19 or are there other economic factors at play here. So with more data gathering and future reports, we'll be able to talk to that point. We at the ITU have a lot of initiatives, and I think I'll take this opportunity to talk about our Connect to Recover. Connect to Recover is an initiative for the reinforcement of digital infrastructure and ecosystems of beneficiary countries. It is expected that digital technologies such as teleworking, e-commerce, remote learning, and telemedicine would support the COVID recovery efforts. It also seeks to galvanize action for affordable and reliable connectivity as part of the COVID-19 recovery strategies. And we have also done a lot of work, especially for those landlocked countries that I mentioned earlier, on a project called the HIPSA project that was a joint project between the ITU funded by the European Union, where there were guidelines developed on what these landlocked countries need to do in order to be able to best utilize the opportunity for access that they have from their neighboring countries that are on the coastal lines of Africa. I think I'll want to stop there for now, and I will be here to entertain any questions that you may have in the Q&A. Over to you, Slim.
Thanks a lot, Aida, for this nice overview. I think many of us maybe are not aware of this issue and this kind of specificity or the specific problem that are, that the landlocked countries are suffering from. So I think that was a very interesting overview. Vint, I think you already want to make a remark here. I see that you're raising your hand. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. These are all fantastic data to have. Ida and Milo and Elizabeth, we really appreciate having some useful data. I just wanted to mention one interesting response at Google to the infrastructure question. In Uganda, we worked together with some other partners to build a municipal optical fiber network, which was made available on a wholesale basis to a number of retailers who competed with each other for business from the consumers in the capital city. And I think we also pursued a similar arrangement in Ghana, in Accra. But the idea here was to introduce a wholesale layer and to make an investment in that so as to facilitate competitive operation at the retail level. You can easily imagine a government deciding to do something like that as well, to deliberately make an investment in infrastructure, or alternatively to deliberately provide subsidies in order to deal with the economic disparity and affordability of internet service. I have a bunch of other comments, but I'll hold them for now, and we'll see how the conversation emerges.
Any extra remarks before we move to some of the questions that have been raised from the audience? Okay.
Let's see. I have to unmute, and I also have to go back and look at some of the questions. Here's one. It says, why is it, do you think, that the internet evolves continuously at breakneck speed, but in the wireless world still insists on Gs? Actually, I don't fully understand the question, because it felt like the G initiatives have also evolved pretty quickly from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G to 6G. But like the famous author has said, the future is here, but it's not uniformly distributed. And that's certainly true for the various wireless access methods, on top of which we're seeing other alternative methods like the LEO satellites going full blast as well. And for Ida, a question for her, I have been very surprised to see how much undersea cable development has been going on in the past decade. Far more undersea cable being built than I had expected would be. Part of it, I think, is economics. Some companies like Google have reached the point where we are building fiber on our own as opposed to partnering with others because it's become affordable. So a number of island nations are connected by fiber that I had not anticipated would be. And I think that's increasing. Vanuatu is a good example where they obtained support from the World Bank to make a high-speed fiber connection to the capital city. So Ida, maybe you can speak a little bit to the various alternative methods for connectivity, including the LEO potential, which strikes me as being pretty exciting, given that it theoretically has 100% coverage.
No, absolutely, When you're quite right on the different modes of connectivity, but we're seeing a very sort of high adoption of fiber because it has translated into lower cost of connectivity. But even where in the countries that are on the coast in Africa, in countries such as Vanuatu, the islands that have actually landed a cable, you still see a very decided digital divide. So we are learning all over that it's not just the availability of the infrastructure for access that determines who's connected to the internet. But you also find that there are other issues at play, such as digital skills, the lack of digital skills, not knowing what to do with it and how to, when you're connected, what exactly you put, what use you put that connection to. And also we're seeing decidedly divides, such as the divide between the numbers of male that are using the internet as opposed to women, and why that is. So the divides are becoming more compounded. We used to talk about the urban-rural divide. Now we're talking about the digital divide in terms of gender. We're talking about digital divide even in terms of digital skills capability. Over to you, Slim. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. There is another interesting question in the chat that all of us are seeing, and I think it's a very good question in the sense that this is the kind of question I actually, in a way, posed in my opening remark. So I read the question. I think part of the problem is that as an industry, we tend to focus on neat new technologies, and the person who's asking the question is giving as an example millimeter wave. But if we want to connect everyone, don't we need to get back to basics like more efficient coverage, more affordable handset? I'm not sure 6G will deliver that. So this is again the always kind of problem that researchers tend to go for these pushing the envelope type of records in terms of higher speed, lower latency, but they tend to forget to go back to basics and extend coverage and connect more people. Anyone wants to kind of answer this question? Okay, let's start with Elizabeth, then Paul.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I don't think those are mutually exclusive. So, like I had in that last graph, I think we can do very interesting innovations that are pushing the envelope for those who don't already have connectivity. And, some of the technologies I mentioned on the last slide are examples of that. So TV white spaces, CBRS, parts of 6G, it's not clear what that's going to be yet. You're right, millimeter wave is not a good technology for a lot of the people who still need to be connected. But I think there's a lot of good things we can do. There's interesting business models. And as a researcher, I think I personally find it a really interesting intellectual problem about how can we design these new technologies for these populations. I think it's just that, with our current models of recouping costs and so forth, a lot of the innovation has been for those who already have the high technologies. But, intellectually, I think it's a much harder and more interesting problem, and certainly can have much bigger impacts if we're focusing on the other half of the population.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Paul?
Yeah, I would actually, Slim, I would actually expand it to beyond just researchers, and I would actually expand it to industry as well. I think in specifically in sort of the mainstream standardization of technology, whether that's in 3GPP or in IEEE, there definitely is a focus on, it all begins with use cases, and the use cases that industry has tended to focus on with next generation technologies have been use cases that basically make internet connectivity better for people who already have it. So what we've seen with next generation of Wi-Fi standardization, we've seen the same thing with 3GPP, like with millimeter wave, massive amounts of throughput, super low latencies, because of the physics of the spectrum that they're operating in shorter distances. So environments with a lot of fiber connectivity, getting closer to the customer, and huge amounts of throughput, and very little thought or really afterthought to other kinds of use cases, that are more applicable to those in the world who currently have connectivity. So what ends up happening is these kinds of issues get dealt with as an afterthought or outside the mainstream standardization process, like some of the activities Elizabeth's involved in and many others. And I guess I think that we need to figure out a way to change that. I don't know whether it happens in the mainstream standardization process or some sort of alternative way of creating technology at a larger scale that actually can address these issues. Because I think if we just wait for the mainstream, the usual way of doing things is not going to solve these problems.
Yeah. But I feel that I'm not sure if others agree with me that in this cycle of the next G, we are talking much more about the digital divide than it was the case, I think, 10 years ago. So I believe there is more, the problem is becoming a more urgent problem, a problem that people feel that the problem eventually has to be solved. So I hope that now that we are at the early cycle of 6G development, as 5G is basically evolving itself, that this issue of connect the unconnected is going to become a big part of the development of the next generation of wireless communication systems. And I guess the evolution of the non-terrestrial networks, as we tend to call them, as part of the 3GPP standard, can help actually see this convergence between satellite and mobile communication that can eventually help connect the unconnected. That's at least my perspective. I'm not sure if anyone want to add to this point. Milo, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is the standards and the tech are building blocks, and people assemble them to build different kinds of solutions. One of the challenges is if you're a large operator and your main business is in the large urban areas or the better off parts of the community, the incremental revenue you get from going after these other less populous or low density areas can be very small. And so you just don't have the motivation to go after that. That's part of the logic behind CBRS and other mechanisms for spectrum sharing that puts spectrum into the hands of people who may be non-traditional actors. And they can use different kinds of technology to leverage that spectrum to deliver service. So today, if you build a network that's optimized for mobile data, it's not nearly as good for fixed. But if you took that spectrum and you built equipment that was sort of optimized for fixed wireless, you can do amazing things. And in the US, we have a lot of WISP using unlicensed spectrum, doing very innovative things. I think if they had access to spectrum that, particularly in areas where traditional carriers are not deploying, they could use 5G and 6G technology in different ways to reach those communities. So part of the problem is in wireless, spectrum is the sort of raw resource. And if you only give it to people who have very limited business models, you're going to get limited service options as a result.
Okay, thanks a lot, Milo. Any extra remark on this point?
I guess one thing I would say is just to add is I think fixed broadband and fixed wireless broadband is really where all the runway is. So I think 5G has been, obviously there's been huge technological innovation and benefit that has come from it, but I think that it's not going to be all that the marketers want us to believe it will be. And I think what industry is realizing is that even in a place like the US, 42 million people don't have broadband available to them if they want to buy it. And then you look at a place like Africa or other emerging markets where the percentages of the population without access to fixed broadband is huge. And if you look at where growth is actually occurring in the industry, it's not happening in the mobile industry anymore. The mobile industry gets to a point of maturity where all they're doing is fighting over the same market pie, and just grabbing market share from each other. Where's the future revenue growth going to be for those companies? It's going to be in fixed broadband connectivity. So I think what we're seeing is a realization in industry and a mainstreaming of a lot of the things that wireless ISPs have been doing for 20 years, which is basically using all kinds of wireless, terrestrial and other kinds of wireless technologies to bring broadband to people. And I think there's a huge opportunity there in the next decade. I think 6G can definitely take advantage of that.
Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Actually, I see Ida has her hand up. I'll follow her.
Okay, go ahead, Ida.
Thank you. I was just going to jump in that question of broadband access and what Paul said about the mobile operators all concentrating on the same pie. That has been to a large extent true, for example, in the Africa continent, but we've also found that universal access funds were set up where there were contributions that were being made to the fund, and these funds were supposed to now be used to roll out infrastructure to rural areas and to other parts of the country that were not enjoying as much connectivity as the urban areas. But what we have found in a whole lot of the countries in Africa and elsewhere is that there has been millions and millions of dollars sitting in those universal service funds that ended up not being used in the sector, but they were just sitting there, nobody was using them. So in some countries, you actually had the government coming to the regulator and saying, look, you're sitting on this pile of money and you're not using it anyway, so why don't I use it for infrastructure like roads? And so there's a lot more to the conversation, especially in developing countries and in the small island states. Over to you, Sue.
Good. Yes, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that, you said that 6G seems like a great opportunity to now address a lot of these connectivity issues. And I would just say, I don't think that it's going to happen organically. I think it needs events like these and people within these organizations really pushing for new business models and new use cases for why we need to do this connectivity, because the Good Samaritan approach hasn't necessarily worked. And when 5G was coming out, it was the same thing, right? We were talking about, oh, this is it. This is how we're going to get rural communities online. And now what we're seeing is that it looks like it's going to make the gap even worse. And so I wouldn't want to get complacent and just say, okay, well, 6G will just evolve and it'll fix it. It's really going to take a lot of advocacy and innovative thinking about business models and use cases and economic incentives in order to really make that change for this new generation of technology.
Okay, thanks. Actually, Vint is making some interesting remark here, saying that some people are reporting a trend towards increased fraction of population moving to cities, and how might that affect connectivity? So, Vint, are you saying that basically the problem is going to disappear because we are not to have any more people living in rural areas?
Well, I don't want to argue that the problem will just go away automatically, but I do think if that is a trend, that we may see the fraction of population that's not connected shrinking on the presumption that they end up in a city that has available urban connectivity. I'm not suggesting that we should therefore just ignore the problem. I'm just wondering whether that trend is significant. As global warming happens, we may see other effects about migration away from the coast, for example, or away from rivers and things of that kind. I did want to bring up one phenomenon that we watched happen in Europe and in Latin America. In the earlier days of the internet, many of the countries had internet services that were not connected to other countries in the region. They went up to, for example, in Latin America, everybody went up to the Nap of the Americas in Miami. And so going from, say Chile to Argentina was, go up to the US and come back down again. In the early days, that was true in Europe, where we had two different, educational networks that were connected to the national research backbones. And to go from one to the other, they went to the US, the East Coast, and then, ping pong back across the Atlantic. The investment in internet exchange points made a big difference because it confined the traffic to the European continent or to LATAM as well. So one thing we might ask ourselves is whether investment in IXP facilities in, for example, Africa would help to confine the traffic to the continent, which would improve a number of parameters, including latency. Of course, this requires agreement among the various parties providing service to interconnect at the internet exchange points, or at some point perhaps having direct peering arrangements because the bandwidth requirement is high enough to justify the cost.
Yeah, Vint, can I just say, these days, with CDNs driving the bulk of consumer traffic and cloud companies being the source of the rest of it, it's not so much people talking to each other that in the old days drove sort of interconnects. It's really interconnection to content sources, which are more concentrated these days than ever before. So thinking about hubs in Africa and in other landlocked areas where you would have CDNs all interconnected and present, as well as sort of cloud edge compute, that could be the source of really reducing the amount of inter-exchange traffic sort of required. It's a very different internet than it was even 10 years ago from a traffic perspective.
Slim, just to reinforce that, one thing that I'm seeing, of course, is what Milo is saying, which is that we built this gigantic network to go out and touch the rest of the internet, and then have our consumers use our cloud-based services within a hop, one hop of their origin network, landing on our what we call B2 network. And so a number of others are doing the same kind of thing, Facebook, for example, Amazon. So you're seeing a massive construction of network connectivity to the immediate ISPs that connect customers into the system. And that too reduces latency and increases access to the CDN facilities.
Okay, very good. Ida, you want to add to this? No, you are muted, Ida.
Just very quickly, I just wanted to say I'm glad that somebody brought up the internet exchange points, which is one policy that a lot of African countries are following. But even in the countries that have actually established internet access points, they're seeing that development of local content is also key. Because, you know, without the development of local content, the traffic is more or less what it used to be before the internet exchange point, because everything that you want to get on the internet, you're having to come all the way to Google to ask it and search for it and whatever, and then it comes back to your country. So yes, internet exchange points, but in tandem, we at least for the developing countries that are trying to play catch up, we also need to look very seriously to the development of local content and of course the development of the digital skills, which is still a big challenge. Over to you, Skip.
I was muted, sorry, I was muted. So actually one of the panelists mentioned actually also just going back to the initial remark made by Vint, that obviously if we improve rural connectivity, we can initiate a counter-urbanization process and kind of go against that trend where people may tend to move to rural areas while kind of keeping a good quality of life, because connectivity will be good even in these remote areas. So that's another argument that we can put forward. You know, we have maybe 15 or so more minutes to go. Let me ask one question that is important, and some of you touched upon this issue as part of your presentation and this discussion, which is the notion of spectrum sharing techniques with unlicensed or shared spectrum networks. We talked about TV white space or CBRS, not in detail. Can some of you tell us a little bit about your experience with TV white space CBRS in the US? How do you think this is kind of making the network more affordable in rural areas, and how this experience can maybe expand beyond the US and even beyond other bands within the US? Who would like to kind of maybe address this question of spectrum sharing, CBRS, TV white space?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about CBRS. CBRS, or Citizens Broadband Radio Service, is a system approved in the United States sharing military radar spectrum. So in the US, the federal government controls a number of large swaths of spectrum. One of them is used by from 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz. And this spectrum is primarily used by the air traffic control radar on aircraft carriers, of which there are not that many. And so we worked at Google with partners in the carriers and in the WISP community to work with the federal government to find a way to share that spectrum by deploying a network of sensors that can detect these radars. And when those radars go active, turn off or move users so that they don't interfere with them. Spectrum sharing has always been sort of possible through administrative processes. But with CBRS, our goal was to replace administrative people, PUBAs, with code and automate that process. And in the US, there's two kinds of CBRS spectrum: general availability, where you have no guarantee of protection from interference, and protected area access, PALs, which are auctioned in sort of the normal way. But CBRS, there's always a chunk of spectrum available for sort of general access. It's not unlicensed in that you have to go connect to a spectrum access system to give you authority to use spectrum in a particular area. And it manages the interference with these other users. There's no reason why that technology couldn't be used to actually share between civil users. So for example, if I've got areas where a MNO has built out and areas where they haven't, you could use a similar kind of system to grant access to that spectrum. So it enforces this sort of priority access to spectrum. You know, it's not the 80s anymore. We can use code now and our models of geospatial data and propagation to actually share spectrum in many more efficient ways. And that has, in the US, allowed WISPs, these wireless internet service providers, to go out and build networks in this band and deliver service in rural areas and rural communities using technology that's more optimized for fixed than mobile. And it's also allowed building owners to build indoor networks, because one of the things we see in the US is more than half of cellular data comes out of indoor locations. So building all this stuff outside doesn't actually help you where the bulk of cellular data comes from. So there's a whole set of interesting things by enabling non-traditional actors, people who own buildings, people who own facilities, people in rural areas, to use spectrum and build broadband solutions optimized for their particular use model. And we think this is a great experience in the US that other countries could benefit from, and not allocating things in the way we used to allocate them in the 90s.
And do you see the CBRS paradigm being used in other part of the bands? I don't know, like around 60 gigahertz and beyond?
We're looking at right now in the 3.1 to 3.55 bands, where you have a lot of military users, where that can be usable. And in the US, we have something similar called AFC, which is taking 800 megahertz of spectrum above the Wi-Fi 5 gigahertz band, making that available for sort of semi-unlicensed use using, again, they call it the AFC, but it's really a spectrum access system. And those are bands where you point-to-point microwave users. And so being able to share point-to-point microwave bands for Wi-Fi style access is eminently doable with spectrum management systems that can compute interference and give you permission to use it.
Sure. Paul, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I can add on to that on TV white spaces, and I suspect Elizabeth may have some comments there as well. But just first, I would say that just overall, the one way to look at this is these are building block spectrum bands, and they're complementary and they're good for different things. And so, what we see, going from TV white spaces, which is, below 1 gigahertz all the way up to millimeter wave, different frequency bands with different propagation characteristics and different ranges, and also just different amounts of spectrum. More spectrum, as Milo said earlier, available in the higher bands, less in the lower bands. So when it comes to something like TV white spaces, I think we just have to think of these things as all being complementary to one another. So ISPs definitely are deploying CBRS technology at a high rate right now, which is great. But what they're going to find is the laws of physics are going to get in the way of them being able to reach certain customers once again. And so it's something like TV white spaces, can and will be a nice complement to what they're doing in other bands to essentially extend the range of of their connections, from the same base station. So adding an extra kilometer or two of radius around the tower to reach more customers and through foliage. What surprised me actually since I left Microsoft is how many companies actually are still looking at TV white spaces, including companies I'd never heard of when I was there. So this is definitely something that's still happening, and it's still a significant opportunity alongside all the other great things that are happening in terrestrial as well as space-based communications. And a lot more regulators are starting to put regulations in place that are allowing more dynamic access to spectrum.
Very good. Any other comment on spectrum sharing and large spectrum type of technologies? Okay, let me ask my final question to wrap up this panel. Okay, Vint, go ahead. Go ahead, Vint.
Slim, I just wanted to respond to your invitation. One of the things that at the FCC in the US that was a point of continuous debate had to do with the stupid receiver versus the smart receiver. And for many years, all of our policies were designed around the idea that the receivers were stupid and the transmitters had to be really smart. They had to confine the spectrum. They had to have waveforms that didn't drift over into or generate power outside of their spectral bands. And the fact that we can build really smart receivers, I think, changes a lot of the dynamics of all of this, including the opportunities for sharing and for moving from one part of the spectrum to another, as Milo was suggesting. But I did want to ask Milo once again to emphasize his point, which is that wireless is all wonderful for that last hop of access, but if we don't tie everything together with an optical fiber network, you don't have what you want, which is a fully connected system.
Yeah, I would just say, again, it's a factor of where are people talking. People don't talk to each other locally. They all talk to either a CDN or a cloud-based server somewhere. And so the backhaul, these networks are not like phone systems for voice. You're not communicating locally. And so that backhaul piece, which could be done with microwave, but typically not at the speeds required, are important. And one thing that we found that could be really useful is when you think about building power infrastructure, distribution of electrical power, putting fiber on the same routes. If you're going to have high tension lines or power electric distribution, why build two completely separate infrastructures to deliver two services when one physical infrastructure can do both? So stringing fiber optic core ground wires on the top of high tension lines or distribution along medium voltage facilities, there's great opportunity if you're building a canal, if you're building power, if you're building gas pipelines, put fiber in at the same time and make that fiber available, because you could use 288 strand cables and make tons of fiber accessible on those routes. Never pay for the same ground twice, I think Patton said, but I think it's useful in this context as well.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Milo. Elizabeth, yes?
Yeah, I'd just like to respond to something Milo said about that we're not accessing content that's local, we're accessing content that's far away. So, in some cases that has to be true. For instance, if we're grabbing a video to watch off Netflix or whatever. But in other cases, that's just an artifact of how we've created an internet for the developed world, right? We've created this internet with an expectation of the fact that people have fast access and they have it in their home and so forth. One of the studies that we've done in a Native American community, and I believe that the results would hold to many other communities, is that there's a heavy predominance of interest in locally generated content, right? Like a lot of my friends are local, and on my Facebook feed and so forth, I see their pictures and so forth. And it's true that that content is stored very far away, but it didn't have to be. It could have been stored within the community, and there's no reason that it has to come down over the satellite link or whatever multiple times. It's really just kind of that perfect example of how we created this internet with a certain set of assumptions that aren't true for the people who ended up not being connected because they don't live in those circumstances. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to point that out because it's kind of the perfect example of what I'm talking about.
A good point, well taken. So I guess we have just a few minutes. There is probably not enough time to take some extra question. What I would suggest is maybe if you want, each one of you can have a kind of a concluding statement, and that will allow us to wrap up this panel. You know, we'll have over the coming 2 days interesting talks about emerging technologies that are promising to, you know, bridge the digital divide. We are talking about LEO satellite, next generation very high throughput satellites, HAPS, free space optics. So, you know, you may want to comment on that or any other kind of final remark that you would like to make before we conclude this panel. Vint, you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. Well, two things. First of all, Elizabeth's point's well taken, and I would say that the CDNs actually have understood exactly the point that you needed to have local access to content in order to reduce latency and to avoid having to transport a lot of the same thing over and over again through the backbone networks.
But it's often not local enough is the problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so let me arm wrestle a little bit about that, because typically it's either the central office or the head end of a fiber or a cable network where you put the CDNs, or you put them into data centers, which I agree tend to be very much more dispersed and distant. But the CDNs are deliberately there in order to localize the content at the place where there is an access network. So maybe one of the arguments is that if you want to propagate content to the rural parts of the country, then you better build an access network that can also house the CDN capability. You know, I don't think we're totally in disagreement here.
No, that's exactly.
You know, get the data closer, regardless of the nature of the content, whether it was locally generated or not. On the free space optics, I just wanted to mention that Google has been experimenting, our X organization has been experimenting with free space lasers that are capable of serving 10 to 20 gigabits a second over 1 to 10 kilometers. And we're using that as an alternative to either point-to-point radio or you know, fiber links in order to build middle mile. And the costs are interesting because it's like $50,000 for a pair of lasers. And that's exciting because it drives a lot of cost out. Of course, it doesn't work very well if it's raining like crazy or snowing or something else. So, you know, the locations are very much, you know, the success is dependent on local conditions. So I'll stop there and just say there's plenty of room here for us to respond.
We'll hear from Baris, who's from Tara, Google kind of spin-off on the free space optic kind of development within Google. So this is one of the talks on Thursday. Milo, any concluding remarks?
No, I would just say modern technology has enabled us to do amazing things. And so how we assemble it really matters. Policy really matters. You know, we had a recent auction here in the United States for C-band spectrum for 5G use that raised over $90 billion for the US Treasury. But that $90 billion could have been spent on actually deploying networks instead of actually going to the US government. And so I think we need to think about if we really are building these networks, which have much deeper footprints. This is not just a few macro cell sites. The economics of building that higher speed infrastructure are going to be very different than building your basic sort of connectivity. And so thinking about spectrum that is not being used to raise money as much as assigning spectrum in an auction to people who will use capital to go deploy networks could be actually net a highly positive thing, not just for the cities and urban areas, but rural areas as well. So governments get to decide how spectrum is assigned and what you're trying to incentivize. And industry is great in terms of responding to incentives. So just be thoughtful about what incentives you're creating by allocating spectrum and right-of-way in a way that that allows that resource to be used to deliver service. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that I have to give the final kind of minute to Samantha, but maybe we want to hear very few, a couple of last words from Paul, Elizabeth, or Ida, if you want. Any final remarks from any one of you?
Just a minute. Yeah, I mean, I think we are actually in a really amazing moment. And you know, I've been in this space for a few decades and seen things come and go. And I think right now, what's incredibly exciting is just the panoply of different technological solutions, different ways of tackling this challenge. You know, 5 years ago, fixed wireless was not as mature as it is today, and there weren't as many options available. And it's definitely much more scalable. Now we have low Earth orbit satellites. We have a whole bunch of other technologies that are available. So I think the technologies are now readily available, and there are a lot of different options that are out there, including free space optics and other cool things. So I think that's not so much the challenge anymore. The challenge are some of the other barriers that we talked about, like access to financing and regulation and those kinds of issues. That's it for me.
Very good. Thanks, Paul. I think we're running out of time. Elizabeth, Ida, maybe one last word just to give you the opportunity to say bye.
I would just say thank you. And we need to keep up the advocacy for this very important topic.
Thanks.
Keep it on the radar of the developers.
Ida?
No, same. I think I'm talking as a person that's coming from a developing country. I think technology connectivity for us has to be meaningful. We don't have to decide between buying bread and access to the internet.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Vint. Thanks, Milo. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Ida. Samantha, back to you.
Thank you. And thanks to Slim and all of our panelists. That was an amazing session. I don't know about you, but I learned a lot. I want to also add an extra special thanks to the Internet Society for being our streaming partner for this event series and enabling so many to join us today from around the world. So thank you so much, Isaac. I can't believe how much we learned. Milo, you went over about the infrastructure and the interaction between spectrum and base stations and how that can invent how many pieces of the network we need to keep track of. That was so amazing. Paul, talking about ESG investing, I am going to be Googling that immediately after this session so I can learn more. And Elizabeth, I think that you said some great things, and Ida about the perspective from developing countries. Thank you so much for everything that you added. For those of you who have not yet registered and have joined us through our streaming portals, we encourage you to register for the full event at themarconisociety.org/decade. If you have not done so already, please do so. We're going to keep the conversation going by attending our next session. We're going to have that again tomorrow. So same time, same place. We look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.